And then I also worry about stuff like maybe we have TikTok plus 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 where everyone just like has a VR headset all day and then it's some kind of like experience machine where you just optimize for experiences and
Yeah.
you lose what
I,
is like important.
I was at a recommender system conference a year ago, like totally by chance. I saw this pop up on my feed. I'm like, okay, I'm gonna go. And the talk that like really stuck in my mind was from one of the Instagram people, where they were effectively benchmarking recommender systems, their classical approaches versus transformer-based approaches, right? And like back early, like there's like early 2024, I guess, something like on that order. They were like, for the first time, like transformer-based approaches were like outpacing their classical like deep learning approaches. Um, and like his comment was like, yeah, like this is great, right? Because currently we're like data limited in our accuracy, right? And now with transformers we're compute limited, and compute limitation is much easier to overcome because we have a very big credit card. And
Yeah.
and like I personally don't really, right. And before that, like improvement was kind of constant, right? Because it basically depended on like new data entering the system, and a more or less constant amount of data enters the system on their end. Also, like the amount of data is absolutely crazy, right? Like he phrased it in tokens, although I don't think tokens is actually how they measure it on the input side. But he said basically like they collect trillions of tokens a day,
Oh
whereas like
wow.
GPT-4 is trained on trillions of tokens total. But yeah, like insane amounts of data, but like basically really limited in the way that they could like deploy that. And like yeah, if this actually now correlates with compute, right, and Meta can just like buy a bigger cluster and effectively the algorithm gets twice as good, and then they can buy an even better cluster and it gets twice as good again. I actually think that's an insanely scary future, and I don't think we've really priced that in.
Hmm.
Uh,
Oh, that's insane. Yeah, because people say like, oh, we run out of the internet, but then you get like the internet is like 30 trillion tokens or something like that. That you get within a month. You have you have another internet.
yeah,
The quality of that might be lower though.
yeah,
Do you
yeah.
worry
There's
about these scenarios of some kind of like the classical philosophical experiment of like if you had an experience machine where you just could just like set on a headset and then you just experience everything to the ultimate and then it's like would you do this or not, like it would be ultimate joy but it would be a very shallow experience.
I
Do you worry
think what
about
it would
this?
um so yes and no, right? I think like, to some degree we've already created these, right? And I think like that's a consequence of these like late stage incentive systems. So it's like, time spent is how you make money, right? And like the best way to spend time is basically just like drip feed content this way, right? And effectively like we're in a 20-year engineering effort to basically get you to spend as much time as you can on these systems, right? Um, and and so I think we're actually pretty close. Like my underlying hope or belief would be that like with every new technology wave, right, effectively the existing tech stack gets wiped, and it usually gets wiped quite conclusively, and that usually realigns incentives to be much closer to consumer preference, right? Because like in a late stage sort of environment, you can stray arbitrarily far from consumer preference because you already have all of that market power. But if it's basically like it gets rejiggled and you now have to fight for people, you end up building products that are much, much better for them. And I think we could see like going back to this like ideal of tech being a tool, right? And you use it to, do something, and back from like you're a tool for technology to make more ad revenue, right? Like that's the current version. And I think like new technology waves have this great kind of like ability to actually do that and push that forward. To me, this is still cyclical. Like I do subscribe to the opinion that AI might be the last technology wave, in which like the last technology wave period, right? Because every other technology wave will effectively happen at an implementation level where we don't really understand, right? Where it's like, a chip will get tapered out. We don't really know what it does, right? But effectively, it does what the AI cares about. The AI writes the software that runs on the chip, right? And then basically it produces some sort of benefit that we care about, right? And like the next generations of technology will just like might just be so far abstracted, and like the next big technology waves might just be so far from like human innovation and human push that it might be the last like technology wave that changes the like changes the balances of power. And in that world, I would absolutely worry about the experience machine, right? But before
Mm.
that, like I just feel like the cycle is too strong, and basically like yeah, you have this like periodical reassessment of consumer preferences and then realignment with consumer preferences. Like ChatGPT is much more aligned with consumer preference than Google, right? Um,
Yes. Yeah.
so like and right, so like I'm quite convinced that the current wave of AI is quite closely aligned with that like with that historical pattern. But yeah, would you put on the experience machine?
I would no, no. I mean, no is the answer that everyone wants to say, right? And
Yeah.
then and
Yeah, it's
then you
like
have
I am so intellectual. I am above the pleasures of the flesh.
yeah.
Blah blah blah. Uh-huh.
Yeah, I read this blog post the other day. It was I forgot the author, but like it was super interesting. It was about I think this went kind of viral on Twitter, so people might recognize it. But it was basically there's a painting from an artist, but he died while painting it, or like he was sick with AIDS, and he died when the painting was just halfway painted, and like the painting in its half painted state is so powerful. Like you look at it and you like, and then he died. Like that is just like it hurts your heart. You
Mhm.
see like death. You see death in how death actually affects the world, and that makes this painting so powerful. And then so, and then in a world with AI where you don't have death, like or you do have death, but like there's no disease. AIDS is not a thing with technology. Then you wouldn't have paintings like this that were half painted. And then the point of the blog post is like, but this is worth it, of course. Like it's of course we would want to save this person from dying if we could, even though
We
this would
probably
make
could already today, right?
yeah.
Huh?
This was
Uh-huh.
in the 80s, I think, or something. But
Yeah,
like
89.
so of course we would want to save him if we could. But then the world would be much more shallow because then we wouldn't have like great art like this. I know it's one example, but I think it's like it's interesting as one data point of how like a shallow world with more joy is actually more shallow. But then again, of course, I want to save him, and I think this is like kind of the parallel to the experience machine. Would you
So
would you do it even though it's more shallow?
I think
Probably
um
yes.
I think there's like this these two competing thoughts I hold in my head, right? Both of which I believe to be true, but somehow like by each other. Like, there's always this like picture of like, oh, the greatest artists are like, these troubled personalities come from deep trauma, right? Like experiences. Like this is the most extreme version of that, right? Like you're dying while you're painting, right? Like it doesn't really get much more traumatic than that. But at the same time, all the literature shows that people do their best work when they feel some security, when they feel some, like when they feel at home in a role, right? Like that's when they perform best, right? Like especially like in the, management literature kind of sense, right? And like that's when they produce the most work. And like I personally believe both of this to be true. Like I have not seen a single team that is ruled through fear and ruled through intimidation and ruled through trauma, right? That like really ends up outperforming, right? And usually the people that like, try to lift the entire team actually push the furthest and like are most successful as a team. And so like I personally I'm like I hold these two things, right? And I know one to be true and I know the other to be true. And it might just be that there's like different things matter in the artistic professions than like the non-artistic professions. And that like the mastery is a different kind of mastery, the problems are different kinds of problems, right? Um, et cetera, et cetera. But like I personally don't believe that that experience, right, necessarily means that what a future humanity could produce would be more shallow, right? Some of the greatest artists that we now look to of like in Renaissance times, right, were incredibly well off, right? Almost all of them were like they were standing there, you're not painting painting a ceiling in a palazzo straight off the street, right? Like these were usually like incredibly well educated, incredibly rich people who, for that time, had any comfort that was conceivable to have, and yet still they produced greatness this way. Or like what we would now see as greatness. I think maybe also, but yeah, maybe I think we've also shifted on what we personally believe to be art, right? Like post-war contemporary art is, I would say, much more somber, much more, I think like the motifs of like death and the motifs of like loss and the motifs of like mental illness are much, much stronger, right? And while like that kind of art might have existed in the past, it never was mainstream, and now it's definitely mainstream. So I think like that has also shaped what we like expect
Mm,
art to kind of be.
interesting. Yeah.
And like that, it might be that like in 50 years people like why should I put this grim dark painting on my wall when instead I could have this like beautiful impressionistic landscape. And I don't like beautiful impressionistic landscapes personally, right? But like I can totally see someone in 50 years having totally 180 on that again.